Amen. Okay. So the last 2 weeks we've been covering a series that's on the God I need, and we've covered a couple of different things. We've covered the God of grace. We last week we covered the God of redemption, and this week we're going to continue in that series. We have this one and at least one other more. I'm pretty sure it's just going to be the four because after that is Palm Sunday. So we're going to continue, and we're going to start in 2 Samuel chapter 9. We're going to read that whole chapter. And as we look at this, what we're going to be talking about, that chapter is the chapter of Mephibosheth. And for those of you who don't know, preachers enjoy preaching on the story of Mephibosheth because it's a pretty cool name to say. And it's almost like saying Mufasa or something like that, right? But Mephibosheth is a very interesting story. And it talks to us about the kindness and the salvation of God. So that's what we're doing today. A God I Need, and the subtitle is A God of Kindness and Salvation. So we understand that the story here it talks about a concept that most people struggle to grasp, especially when they first come to the Lord. And even those who may have been with the Lord for quite some time, sometimes they still struggle to grasp exactly what it means. And their mind will go back to some of the things that have imprisoned them in the past. So some of the sins that have locked them up in the past, that keeps on going back to that. And so we're going to try and get a little bit of a grasp on this and understand that when we speak about salvation, an hour typically isn't enough to scratch the surface of what we actually need to understand about salvation. But we're going to try and get some of the stuff out there. And I want to make sure that we also understand that when we talk about these topics, and I'm sure everybody does, but when we talk about these topics, they're not just theological ideas that exist. They're not just topics that we have for discussion or something that we take notes on and then we throw the notes up on the bookshelf with all the other irrelevant books that we might have on our bookshelves. But it's a topic, especially with salvation, with grace, with God's redemption, His redemptive love. These are topics that as we cover them, they're topics that we have to not only fully understand, but remain engaged in, if I can word it like that, to be able to have an effective walk with Jesus Christ in our life. And it doesn't mean that there's any certain list of things that we're doing, but understanding these topics and remaining in our walk in the way that they teach us to walk will help us as they become a daily staple of our lives and our existence with Jesus Christ. So while we'll cover a lot today, like I said, we won't be able to cover the entire subject, but we know that salvation in Jesus Christ is spoken of quite often throughout the New Testament. It tends to, for some reason, be the primary subject in the New Testament. I'm not sure exactly why on that, but pretty sure that it's pretty important based off of how much they speak of it. And we may not see the word salvation in every single verse, but we can tie every single verse in the New Testament to the salvation that Jesus Christ Himself provides. So, beginning in Samuel chapter 9, 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1. And it says, "And now David said, is there anyone who is left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. So when they had called him to David, the king said to him, Are you Ziba? He said, At your service. The king said, Is there not still someone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? And Ziba said to the king, There is still a son of Jonathan who is lame in his feet. So the king said to him, Where is he? And Ziba said to the king, Indeed, he is in the house of, let me see if I can pronounce this right, Machir, the son of Emil in Lodabar. Then King David sent and brought him out to the house of Machir, the son of Emil, from Lodabar. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face, prostrated himself. Then David said to Mephibosheth, Then David said, Mephibosheth? And he answered, Here is your servant. So David said to him, Do not fear, for I surely will show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and ye shall eat bread at my table continually. Then he bowed himself and said, What is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog as I? And the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given to your master's son all that belonged to Saul and to all his house. You, therefore, and your sons and your servants shall work the land for him, and you shall bring in the harvest, that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall eat bread at my table always. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, According to all that my lord the king has commanded his servant, so will your servant do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who dwelt in the house of Ziba were the servants of Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he ate continually at the king's table, and he was lame in both of his feet. So a very, very interesting story and condensed, and that's just part of the story. We're going to reference other parts of the story as we speak today, or as we look at this today, and maybe give us a little bit of understanding in a couple of different areas as well with the life of Mephibosheth. But there's a little bit of background that I want us to understand before we really get involved into anything, and that's where David is at right now. So we're looking at the life of David. And as we read through the Bible, whether we're reading in the books of Kings, or whether we're reading in the books of Chronicles, or in this instance in Samuel, the books of Samuel, or whatever other books we happen to be reading, sometimes that's what we do, is we just read it. And we don't really understand exactly what's going on. We don't understand all of the extra intricacies, all the details that will probably help us to understand the story a little bit more. So let me explain a couple of things. At this moment, we're at a moment in which David has sat down and he's reflecting on his life, because David has been sitting on the throne at this point in time for about 20 years. And it doesn't seem like that when you're reading through the Bible. It just seems like it's that quick, maybe a year or two after he's taken the throne, because surely if he made a promise to Saul that he was going to not wipe out his entire house and that he would take care of his descendants, surely he wouldn't have waited 20 years to do that, right? Because we know that there's not a single account in the Bible in which it's years upon years after a promise being fulfilled, right? Or maybe there is. Maybe it's more often that way than something immediately happening, right? So we know that it's about 20 years, because we know that when Saul was killed, Mephibosheth was just a baby. And he was being carried off by one of the servants. And as the servant was carrying him off, he wasn't born lame. She dropped him, and it probably broke up his legs pretty good when she dropped him, and he became lame. He couldn't walk anymore. So we know that we're about 20 years based off of the way that Mephibosheth is spoken to, and that he has a son also. Probably about 20 years into David's reign, which would make David about 50 years old at this time. So also at this time, David has now conquered everything that will belong to the kingdom of Israel underneath him. The reason I say underneath him is because when his son Solomon takes over, he conquers more lands. But underneath him, David is at the peak of his reign, and he's conquered all the lands, and he's finished with all of his wars on one side, but he has yet to war with his own son Absalom. So he's right in that couple of years of peace that he has in his life. And as he's looking at this, he begins to reflect on things in his life. He reflects on all that he's conquered. He reflects on where he came from. But one of the most important things that he begins to reflect on is he begins to reflect on the relationship that he had with his friend Jonathan, who was the son of Saul. And it's a pretty significant relationship, because Jonathan, when he realized that David was to become king after him, instead of doing what was customary at that time and killing David so that he would ensure that he would become king, he surrendered and he helped to protect David from his own father that was going to kill him. That's the kind of love and friendship that they shared between each other. That's the kind of respect that they shared between each other. But it was even more than that. That's the way that they both followed God, because Jonathan understood that it was promised by God and that David had already been anointed under the command of God to become king. So there was no way that he would become king. And he respected that. So the two had a very, very loving friendship that many people seek today even. And so David remembers about how about 25 years before he made the promise to Saul. So about 5 years before Mephibosheth was even born, he promised Saul, I'm not going to wipe out your house. Once you're gone, I will take care of your people. And when he promised this, he actually promised this because Saul was hunting him down at the time. And Saul was trying to kill him. And Saul had to go take care of business. And of course, they didn't have porta-johns back then. So he went up a mountain into a cave, which just happened to be where David and his entire army were hiding. And he went in there not knowing that they were in there. And David snuck up on him. And all of his army was saying, go ahead and kill him now while you have the chance. His army's outside. Just go kill the guy. And David refused to, because he said, I will not lift my hand against God's anointed. So even though God had already pulled his spirit away, and we know that, even though David probably understood that God had already pulled his spirit away, he still referred to Saul as God's anointed, because God was the one that placed Saul through Samuel into that position. So in David's mind, it would be God that would remove him and not him, because he saw it not as a sin against Saul. He saw it as a sin against God to do anything that was contrary to what God had established. And perhaps if people today were to look at things like that, it'd be a completely different world. But sometimes we think, well, God needs my help. God needs me to go and do this. And sometimes that may be true. It's not that he needs our help, though. It's that he uses us as his instrument to accomplish his will. And David understood that as well. So 25 years before he had made the promise, right after cutting off the corner of Saul's robe and going outside and waving it around, and he felt bad even about doing that, waving it around and said, see, if I was truly your enemy, I could have just killed you. But I won't, because you're God's anointed. And then Saul repented, and that's when Saul made him make the promise. And we understand that Saul went after David again the second time and tried killing him. And David snuck into his camp and stole his spear and once again said, see, I'm not going to kill you. I'm not your enemy. And then it was just shortly after that Saul and Jonathan both were killed by the Philistines. And then because of that, David still understanding that for somebody, anybody, whether it was him or anybody else, to do something contrary to what God desired was sin. So because they killed Saul, God's anointed, David went and killed everybody that had anything to do with it. And then at that time was when Mephibosheth was born, and he was carried off. So that's what I want to cover as to leading us into this. So that's all the free stuff right there. So as we begin, first point that I want to look at is Mephibosheth was broken. So as we enter this, Ziba was the servant of Saul, and he was the one that responded when David was looking for somebody of Saul's house. He was the one that they said, hey, there's a servant over here, and he probably knows. Which that in itself was a miracle also, because this was the servant. This was the main guy over Saul's house. So why is it a miracle? Because the main guy over Saul's house, when a new king took place, he would have been killed also, and he wasn't. He was spared. So we see how God was working. His how can I say it? His providential protection was at work here. And it wasn't just that he was protecting portions of Saul's house. He was protecting David because David had given his word, and that he would protect God. So we find Ziba, and he comes in, and we understand that God's plan of grace and mercy and kindness existed throughout the entire account that we're looking at right now. Because to begin with, like I said, Ziba should have been dead, because the kings would wipe out anybody who was loyal to the previous king, because they didn't want somebody holding a grudge and coming back later and rising up against them and creating issues within their kingdom. So they would have wiped out everybody. So Ziba also would have been the only guy that really knew everything that had happened in Saul's house. He would have been that guy. He probably would have known more than what even Jonathan knew, because this was the guy that Saul that ran his entire house. And he wouldn't have been so much a servant like what we think of nowadays. If we were to look at it from the military standpoint, he would have been almost like the chief of staff. He was the guy who the commander-in-chief or the commander would turn to make sure everything was in order so that he could accomplish what he wanted to. So he had to be fully understanding of everything that had happened in Saul's life, everything that Saul was planning, everything that was going on in Saul's family. He would have had to have had knowledge beyond anybody else so that he could direct things. So they call Ziba, and Ziba comes. He said, yeah, there's one. And that could have been it. He could have said, yeah, there's one guy that still exists right now. Because I remember a child that was carried off, and he was spared because nobody else even knew about him. So he could have said, I was one. But it was interesting as I looked at this, that when you look at it, it wasn't just that he said that one existed. But the way that he said it actually wasn't in support of Mephibosheth. He goes, yeah, there's one, but he's lame. In other words, he's kind of worthless. Why do you want anything to do with him? And there's a couple of thoughts that were out there. One thought is that perhaps the reason that he said, yeah, but he's lame, was because he didn't want David doing anything to harm Mephibosheth or any family that he would have had. The reason I don't agree with that thought is because David in his speaking to Ziba stated, is there one that exists from the house of Saul that I can show him God's mercy to? So he would have known that David meant him no harm by David making that statement at that point in time. So but that thought does exist, and I wanted to bring that up. The other thought is that he brought it up because he understood that David wanted to show God's mercy to him. So he knew that there was going to be some type of benefit that came from that. So he said, yeah, but he's lame, hoping that what they would do then was invoke a rule that existed within Judaism, that if there was not an heir or an heir that could take care of things, then everything would go to the lead servant. And that would become the heir. And so most people think that that was probably the reason that Ziba responded the way in which he responded. So it had no value to David that the guy was lame. David didn't care. He didn't ask for that information. He just asked, is there one? He didn't ask if there was one that was healthy or one that was injured or anything. He didn't care about it. He just wanted to know if there was one so that he could fulfill his promise. So as we continue on, we realize that Mephibosheth, because of what Ziba said, Mephibosheth would have actually faced a pretty hard life, because life was hard. And it's not that it's easy nowadays for anybody who has any type of handicap, but life was hard for anybody who was handicapped back then. We see this in the New Testament. Jesus is passing by the pool, and he sees a lame man laying at the pool. And every year the angel would come down, and it would trouble the water. It would touch the water, and the first person into the water would be healed of their ailment. And Jesus walked by, and he looked at this guy, and he said, hey, why aren't you getting in the water? What's going on? And the guy looked at him and says, I've been laying here for years, and I haven't been able to get in because there's nobody who's going to help me. Nobody at all that will help me. So when the angel comes and troubles the water, and I start that away, somebody jumps in front of me, and they get the healing instead of me. And that's typically the way that it was. When we look at the man at the gate, when Peter and John were going to the temple, we look at the man at the gate, and he's sitting there begging for alms. We look at the blind man. Blind Bartimaeus is one of my favorite accounts in the Bible. And they were at the gate, and they were crying out. Blind Bart cried out louder when they told him to be quiet, because they didn't care about him. He was damaged goods. The guy at the gate, they didn't care about him. He was damaged goods. Even the lame guy that Jesus himself healed, that the disciples asked him, who sinned, him or his parents? They'd already discarded him. If something had happened in their life like that, there was something wrong with that person, so they were worthless to society at that point in time. They couldn't benefit society. And perhaps maybe something that we might be more familiar with if anybody's watched movies about that particular time period. One of the more famous ones is the movie 300. And we see that there's one that was in there in which the guy is all hunched over. And he was born like that. And as King Leonidas is speaking to this guy, because the guy wants to serve King Leonidas, as he's got his 300 men that are going to stand up to the Persians, King Leonidas lets him know that, you know, he can't. You know, he can pull the bodies aside if he wants to help, but he can't provide anything useful to his army because he's deformed, he's handicapped, and he can't do it. And the guy got really upset about it. And that's where Mephibosheth is. Most likely, in order to gain anything, Mephibosheth would have been set out by a gate or by the entrance of a city or maybe near a temple where people would pass by regularly, and lots of people would pass by. And he would beg for the food that he had. He would beg for some money so that he could pay for food for his family, so that he could have a place to live. So that was the only choice that he had. Not like when we see some of the panhandlers out here that they have choices to go get jobs. But maybe some of the other ones that they can't hold a job because of whatever it is that's holding them back in their life. That would have been Mephibosheth. As he would have been the guy that was sitting there begging because he had no other choice. That was the only way for him to make means. So he would have had a very, very hard life. And no one to help because he wouldn't have been able to afford a servant. Now, if he had family, which it makes mention of him having a son, but it doesn't say how old, but most likely wouldn't have been that old because it's only about 20 years into Mephibosheth's life. So even if Mephibosheth would have had a kid around 15, you're looking at maybe about a 5 or a 6-year-old son. Not too awful much that they could do to help out. So he would have had a hard life. And the reason that I focus so much on this part of Mephibosheth is because when we look at us as people, we were broken too. At one point in time, we were broken. And sometimes even after we come to Christ, there's still a certain amount of brokenness that exists within us because we just can't let it go. We're stuck in it. And we feel that we're called by the King, but perhaps our calling by the King, being Jesus Christ, is much like what Mephibosheth would have most likely been feeling when all of a sudden there comes a knock at the door. And somebody says, the King wants to see you. Oh my, he found me. What in the world is going to happen to me now? Can you imagine that going through it? The heart starts beating real fast.
What is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog?
And he's just wanting to hide at that point in time. Perhaps he's wanting to run. But that brokenness that existed in Mephibosheth may have in all actuality been some type of a blessing for God. For a number of reasons. Because maybe when Mephibosheth would have turned 20, if he wouldn't have been broken, if his legs would have been fine, then maybe when he turned 20, maybe he would have tried to raise up an army and he would have tried to go up against David, who was God's anointed, and he would have tried to kill him. And then he himself would have ended up dead. Perhaps that would have happened if he was not lame. Perhaps if he was not lame and the knock came at the door, that he would have gotten up and it would have been like an episode of Cops, and out the back door he would have gone, and then here come the cameras and everything else chasing after this guy. And they would have caught him and locked him up and thrown him into prison or killed him, or even worse, before they could get him back to David. So perhaps the lameness was a blessing in disguise that happened. The brokenness was a blessing that in disguise that happened, because sometimes those trials that we go through, sometimes the brokenness that exists in our life is a blessing from God. We just don't see it like that. And we should, because there's so many accounts in the Bible in which there were brokenness. And I love going back to Joseph all the time. There was a brokenness that existed in Joseph after his brothers sold him into slavery. But even when he was in jail, it points out that God was with him. So even though he was in jail, even though he was in a broken state, Joseph was actually being blessed by God and moved into a position to where God could do great things for him. The second point, Mephibosheth was rejected. Mephibosheth was rejected. He was sent away. He was sent away for a number of reasons. The reason that he was sent away first was because if he wasn't sent away, he would have surely died. Because before David would have ever been able to get to him, those that followed David would have killed him off. They would have left no trace of him. So it was either that he would die or he would be forced to live in exile for the rest of his life. That's the way that it worked back then. But you see, that was the thing, was that God, even though that exile happened to him, God was still able to come back to him after a period of time. You see, we understand that him being carried off into exile was what actually caused his brokenness. He was carried off in the middle of the night as a baby to keep from him getting killed, because they didn't know what was going to happen. And as the maidservant was carrying him off, she was in such a hurry, and I don't know if she had other things with him. It doesn't specifically say that she was carrying other things. It just said that she was carrying him. But she was in such a hurry that she stumbled and she dropped the baby. And when she dropped the baby, that was what crippled him. And it left him worthless. To those that existed in the time, it left him worthless. There was nothing that he would be able to do for anybody else. There was nothing possible that he would be able to do to rise to challenge the David as the heir of the throne in man's eyes. There was just nothing that he could do. So instead, he lived in exile. Mephibosheth lived in hopelessness. Point 3, Mephibosheth lived in hopelessness. So the fear always existed in the back of Mephibosheth's mind because of the way that customs and traditions were back then. The fear would have always existed in his mind that if the king ever found him, he would kill him. It was the custom. Everybody followed the customs, right? Except in this case. He would have had hopelessness because he was crippled. There was nothing that he could really do to provide for himself or his family other than begging. That was the only lifestyle that he had. It was the only lifestyle that he would have known up until this point. And he would have been hopeless because there was no inheritance. Because even though Saul would have been rich as the king, even though Jonathan, his father, would have been rich as the prince, there was no inheritance, because where they died and they were no longer in those positions of authority, there was nothing left to them, because the king David would have taken it all and it would have become his. So there was no hope of an inheritance. And as we look at it, we realize that one, we too were rejected. And two, it wasn't that God rejected us. We were rejected because of sin. But two, there's a hopelessness that exists because of the sin in our lives. There's a hopelessness that exists without Jesus Christ. And I want to read Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. And for those of you that don't know, I use the New King James Version. So if my wording's off a little bit, that's why it might be just a different translation than I'm using. So in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, it shows us that there is a hopelessness that exists when we don't have Christ. And beginning in verse 11, it says, "Therefore remember that you, once the Gentiles in the flesh, who were called uncircumcised by what is called the circumcision made in the flesh by hands, that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world." Without God in our lives, without Jesus Christ having come in our lives, we were hopeless. There's nothing for us without Jesus. And yeah, we may be able to look out and we can see, Bill Gates does pretty good without Jesus. Or name any one of those billionaire guys that doesn't follow Christ. They do pretty good without Jesus. But there's still no hope. Their hope is in something that's perishable. It's in the money that they have. Maybe not a bad thing to have hope in, but it's not the best thing to have hope in. because their money won't buy them an eternity with Jesus Christ. Once they die, they're dead, and they're cast in the eternal separation from God himself. That's pretty hopeless. I don't want to end up there. I don't want anybody to end up there. And my hope is that anybody who I'm able to speak to about Jesus Christ will come to the same conclusion. I don't want to spend eternity without Jesus in my life. Mephibosheth lived far away. Point 4, Mephibosheth lived far away. So when we look at it, and Ziba speaking about him, he says that he lived in Lodabar. Okay, so Lodabar would have been across the Jordan River. Lodabar would have been what's in the current country of Jordan, the modern day country of Jordan, and it was 90 miles from Jerusalem. Okay, yeah, that's what, like an hour away, right? Cruising along at 80, 90 miles an hour. It's only about an hour away. That's not too far. But back then, that was a 4 or 5 day journey. It took them a while. And not only was it a 4 or 5 day journey, but then you had to worry about all the supplies and everything to get there. Okay, so why do I bring this up? Oh, and they actually had to find a town, because the town wasn't a very well-known town either. So why do I bring this up? Because at 90 miles away, in a very unknown town, it would have been difficult to know where to look for him. Now, once you got there, maybe there was only a few houses or whatnot, and all you had to do was go and knock on the houses. But to get there, it would have been difficult, because you would have had to be able to provide the supplies, not just for you and whoever was going with you, in this case, David's men, but also for the animals that went with you, the horses that you were riding, or perhaps the camels that you had that were packing all the materials for you. You would have had to incur a very large expense. So today, it would have been the equivalent of, perhaps I'm looking for somebody, and they are living in the little town of, let me think of a very small town that perhaps nobody knows about. They were living in Oberammergau, Germany. Does anybody know where Oberammergau, Germany is? No? Okay. So Oberammergau, Germany is actually more important than what Lodabar was, because that's where the NATO leadership school is at. So people who do a lot with NATO in the military would know where it's at, but most other people wouldn't. Oberammergau, Germany is also a place in which, how many of you have watched The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson? Okay, so Oberammergau every 4 years will actually shut down the entire city to put on the play of The Passion of Christ for the entire week before Easter. And it's kind of cool. But very few people know about Oberammergau unless they're from Germany or Oberammergau, maybe some of the surrounding areas around there. But it would be kind of expensive to get over there and find somebody. Samantha and I were looking, if we were to ever take a vacation to Europe right now, and to take a flight to Germany would have cost, what, about $2,000, wasn't it? About $2,000. So that'd be $4,000 for myself and her. But then we'd have to find a babysitter for a week to leave the kids. Or we could pay $2,000 a piece for each of them also. And if my memory serves me right, Oberammergau was one of the more expensive places in Germany for you to go out and get food. There were a couple of small grocery stores, but we were staying in a hotel that didn't have a place for us to cook, so we had to go to the restaurants. And then on top of that, you have to pay for the hotel that you're staying in also. If you have a grandfather clock or a cuckoo clock that came from Germany, that's probably where it came from. That's where they make a lot of them. It's down in the Black Forest and all. Anyway, so it would have been the equivalent of doing something like that, only instead of being able to make it within a 24-hour period because you were able to sleep on the flight, you would have had to drive your car across the country and then hop on a boat once you got to the East Coast and ride that boat up to Greenland, and then ride that boat across the ocean over to Europe, and then they drop you off in Portugal, and then you hop in a vehicle again. Or maybe they went on to the north side of Germany right there where it has a port. And then you hop in another vehicle or hop on a train, and then you ride that down to Oberammergau. So it would have been the equivalent more of that it would have taken quite some time and quite an expense to be able to make it there. So why do I bring this up? Because even though he was that far away, there was a promise that was made by the king. There was a promise that he would take care of anybody of Saul's lineage that he could, to be able to preserve that lineage. And we have that same promise today because we're far from God. And it's not that God is saying, hey, you have to make it to me, but it's that God came to us. Just as the king sent his men, God came to us also. But even still, it was far away. Colossians 1:21 states it like this, as far as us being far away. And you who were once alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet he is now reconciled. So he did it. It talks about us having been far away, but he did it, just as King David did it for Mephibosheth. We were far away, but God came to us. Point number 5, Mephibosheth is shown kindness. Mephibosheth is shown kindness. And it's not just any kindness. The kindness that David wants to say, he says, let me find the verse here. He says, is there anyone who is left in the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake in one place? And then when Ziba says that there is one that lives, then David responds to him, do not, sorry, that's Mephibosheth right there. Then David talks about, is there still someone in the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? The mercy of God. That word kindness, it doesn't necessarily do the best when we look at the definition of kindness. Okay, so go out and buy him something from McDonald's and send him on his way. That's pretty kind, right? You bought a meal for him. It's talking about the loving kindness of God, the mercy of God, the grace that exists of God. He's going to do something for him that nobody would have done back then. One, he's going to let him live. But two, David later goes on to say that he's going to restore to him all the lands of his grandfather Saul, which would have been quite a bit of land, because it would have been all that Saul's family had owned before Saul became king. And then on top of that, it would have been everything else that became Saul's while he was king. Not the stuff that was of Israel, but the stuff that he himself personally was able to buy and to hold. That way he could pass it on as an inheritance. It would have been quite a bit of land. It would have been like being the heir to the King Ranch in Texas, where at one point in time it was millions of acres under the same ranch. It would have been all the cattle that were on that, and all the horses that came with it, the equipment on the King Ranch to keep it running. It would have been all that. In other words, the guy would have been an instant success. Perhaps it would have been like being Elon Musk's heir, that overnight after he passed away, not as much now, it's only a measly $100 billion that he would be able to give you now, but not the $300 billion anymore. But I don't know that I would turn my nose up to it. But that's the kind of inheritance that Mephibosheth would have been getting. That's the kindness that he would have been shown by David, because David remembered a promise that he had made 20 years before. So Mephibosheth would have understood by this time what it meant to struggle. And all of a sudden there wouldn't have been a struggle. David kept the promise. He didn't consider what Saul did to him. He didn't consider what Mephibosheth's condition was. He only considered the promise that he had made before God. And he wanted to fulfill that promise. So he gave not only the land, but then he took somebody who was Ziba, and he said, you are going to manage this for him, because obviously he can't. You're going to raise the crops up. You're going to take care of the animals. And everything that you're able to bring in the harvest, everything that you're able to bring in for him, you're then going to take that and you're going to give it back to him. And you're going to give it to his family so that he can eat, because you don't really have to worry about him, because he's going to eat at my table. And it's not just that he's going to eat at my table as a guest. He's going to eat at my table like he's one of my own kids. I think about that, and I look about when I was younger, and I would talk to my grandmother about when we lived with my stepdad for a little while. And she said, the thing about it was he understood that you weren't his kids. So you didn't eat as good as his kids. She goes, he would literally be eating steaks and potatoes and all sorts of vegetables with his kids. And then you guys, you might get some mac and cheese. And that's it. And I look at that, I'm like, well, that might not have been a bad thing because my kids get mac and cheese a lot and they're my kids, but it's usually because that's the only thing that they want to eat. Maybe that's why I got mac and cheese, but mac and cheese is a staple of life, that's for sure. Especially if it's the Velveeta one. Yeah. Yep. We have some of those. Take them out to eat. Let's go to, you name the fanciest restaurant in town and we'll go out and eat. Okay. We get there and they look at the menu, mac and cheese or chicken nuggets. It's like $20 worth of mac and cheese right there in a little bowl. I can fix the same thing for $5. But, right. But he ate as one of his kids, which meant that if his kids were eating the steaks, the filet mignon, the chicken, chicken a la king or whatever, think of your favorite meal that was out there. If the kids ate it, he ate it because he was considered one of the kids. That was the kind of kindness that was shown to him. He was no longer treated as a servant. He was no longer even treated as an enemy, which most kings would have considered him an enemy because of who he was descendant of. He wasn't treated as an enemy. He wasn't treated as a servant. He wasn't treated as a friend. He was treated as a child, as somebody who would be gaining the inheritance later, somebody that he was going to raise up in the right ways. And we understand that this is the same thing that has happened to us. We were shown kindness. Romans chapter 5, verse 8 tells us that we were shown kindness. It says, but God demonstrated his own love towards us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Remember when Jesus said, no love greater have a man than this, that he would lay down his own life for his friends? And he did it. But he did it even before we were his friends. He did it while we were still sinners. And as sinners, we wouldn't have been considered his friends. As sinners, we would have been considered his enemies because we would have been doing those things which were contrary to what God wanted done. We wouldn't have been considered friends at that point in time. Mephibosheth wouldn't have been considered a friend. According to all accounts, he would have been an enemy. But instead, David said, you're my child. The same thing that God did for us. We are heirs, co-heirs with Jesus Christ at this point in time because God looked at us as his children. Point number 6, Mephibosheth is restored. He was given the seat at the table for life. The way that David would have announced it, there would have been no way for him to go back on it. It was for life because David said, this is the way it's going to be as long as he lives. To have a meal with somebody in the Middle East is to be considered friendly, to be considered trusted. I can remember the times that I was over there and the interpreters would call us over. During the early parts of the war, they would say, hey, let's have a meal together. All right, come on to the base and we'll have a meal together. That way we're at least in a safe area. And they'd come onto the base and we'd go over to wherever the interpreters' tents were and we'd sit down and we'd have a meal with them. And I remember one time as we were sitting that one of the interpreters said, if you were to go and sit and have meals with the elders of the towns, you wouldn't have problems with them. Really? Why is that? Well, because if you go and have a meal with them, you're then considered a friend. You're then considered part of the family. They're going to take care of you. And they'll feed you. And you get to enjoy customs. And I got to say, some of that stuff looked pretty disgusting. But it was kind of like with Amara. Amara, it's hard to get Amara to eat. And one day I was sitting there and I was like, she goes, what is that? And I was like, you don't want any of this. It's nasty. She goes, ooh, let me taste it. And it was kind of like that. I would see these things that were over there and they looked just completely disgusting. And you taste it. And man, they were some of the great foods, some of the greatest foods that you could have had. And, but we got to sit down and we got to eat. And we would then begin eating with these, instead of just with the interpreters, with these leaders in the towns. And we realized that as we were doing this, that the attacks on us were dropping. And then we also, because they had given us something, we would give them something. So I remember one specific instance that we ate in Nazaria. And we took, because there was an orphanage that was there, and it had been completely destroyed. And we took supplies and we dropped them off and said, hey, here's to rebuild. And they're like, well, thanks for the supplies to rebuild, but we can't rebuild because we don't have the tools to use those supplies. So then we decided, well, okay, we'll just send over the men and the equipment and we'll rebuild the orphanage ourselves. And then we started giving them the school supplies, the pencils and the papers and whatever else that we could give them so that they could teach the kids. And we started seeing the community that was there grow closer to us. And then we'd start giving them soccer balls. And we realized that when there were no kids around, there was something bad that was going to happen. But when the kids were around and we had made friends with the kids, that everything was good. The people were happy. So we didn't have to worry about anything. And why do I bring up Nazaria? Because this one area in Nazaria that we were building this orphanage in was also the second time that my unit was attacked, was in this area. And we were hated so much that we weren't even attacked by the adults that were there. We were attacked by kids that were 12 and 13 years old because they hated us. But as we started having dinner with them, we became like family. And that went away. And that's the way that it was in the Middle East. So for him to be invited to the king's table was something that was significant. It was something that he had committed to take care of him. And that's the thing with Jesus, is we read about Jesus, how he would go and he would sit with the sinners and the publicans and the tax collectors and all this, and he would be criticized for that. Why are you going and eating with them? Because he knew that they needed it. And to this very day, Jesus continues to eat with the sinners. He continues to invite us in so that we can be his family. He continues to spend time with us so that we can be taken care of by him. The shame is removed. And there's nothing that Mephibosheth could have done, like I've said so many times, nothing that he could have done in his brokenness to have gained it. Just like there's nothing that we can do to be able to gain as Jesus restores to us as well. As he provides his love, as he provides his grace. Psalms 23:3 says, he restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. That was David's words. But those same words can be applied to us as well. Mephibosheth also had lasting hope after all was said and done. He had lasting hope. He was given an inheritance for his land. He was given servants to work the land. Now, granted, we see later in chapter 16, part of the rest of the story that I was going to talk about very briefly, we see that Ziba is lying against Mephibosheth to be able to gain all that land for him. And that's why I believe that that's the reason that he brought that up, was because he began to lie against Mephibosheth. But he didn't just do it at any time. He waited for the opportune time. So this would have been about 5 more years along after Mephibosheth had been invited to David's table, because this would have been at the time that David was fighting with Absalom. So David's mind wouldn't have been focused on making sure that Mephibosheth was coming to the table every day and eating with him, and that everything was taken care of in his land, and that there wasn't any discord within his household. David's mind was on gaining back his kingdom, because he had been chased out of Jerusalem by Absalom. So his mind wasn't right. And one day he comes and he's looking for somebody to help him. And lo and behold, Ziba shows up. And David says, what about Mephibosheth? All the things that I've done for him, and he can't even come here. And Ziba showed up and he lied about Mephibosheth. So why do I bring that up? Because the reason I bring that up is because not everyone who appears as if they're helping you will remain loyal to you. And it actually reminds me of a little story that a rancher once told me in Texas. Rancher by the name of Tex McHorse. It doesn't get any more Texan than that. Tex McHorse was his name. And he said, I was probably about 17 years old at the time, 16, 17, somewhere around in there. And he goes, there was a bird flying along one winter. And it was a really, really cold winter storm that came along. And as that bird's flying along, his wings just froze. So because he couldn't move his wings anymore, he fell to the earth into a big old pile of snow. And he tried working his way out, and he got about halfway out, and he froze. And he just sat there frozen, just an ice cube. He was still alive, but he froze. And he said, and then as he's sitting there and he's frozen, this cow comes along. And this cow he empties himself on top of this bird. Just the way Tex put it, he crapped all over him. I was like, oh, okay, well, that's nice. He goes, yeah. But as that bird sat there in that pile of dung, he warmed up and he thawed out. And so the bird climbs out of the pile of dung and he starts whistling because now he's thawed out and he can fly off again. And as he's sitting there whistling, along comes a cat and scoops him up the rest of the way out of the pile of dung and eats him. And I looked at him and I said, that's a pretty interesting story there, Tex. He goes, yeah. Not everybody who craps on you is your enemy. And not everybody who gets you out of a pile of crap is your friend. That's some cowboy knowledge, Tex. And we see that with this story. We see that the one that was assigned to Mephibosheth truly had his own interest in mind the entire time. Tried taking away the lands. But here's the interesting thing, was Mephibosheth's response. Because Mephibosheth came back, and even though David had given all of his land to Ziba, because he thought that Ziba was the one that had actually come to help out him, being David, he gave all the land to Ziba, which left Mephibosheth with nothing other than what? The promised seat at the table. Mephibosheth would still eat. So Mephibosheth comes back to David and he says, wait a minute, this guy lied against me. He didn't have my interest in mind. I wanted to come and help you, and he told me that he would take care of it. And then he came and he told lies about me to you, saying that I didn't want to have anything to do with you. That I was just kicking it back in Jerusalem, living the high life because of what you had done for me already. So David says, okay, well, instead, why don't you and Ziba split it? Maybe that'll take care of some of the issues that y'all are having between each other, and both of y'all will still get an inheritance. How's that? And he says, and aside from that, I really don't want to talk about it anymore. And Mephibosheth's response was amazing, because Mephibosheth looked at David and he goes, you know what? Go ahead and give it all to Ziba. And he wasn't doing it out of bitterness. He said, give it all to Ziba. Because you have treated me good and you still provided me a seat at your table. And sometimes it's like that with us. Perhaps there's somebody that we had trusted that we no longer feel that we can trust because something happened between us. Perhaps that exists. But our response should be the same as Mephibosheth. You know what, God? You still treated me good, so I'm still going to do the things that you want me to do. I'm still going to live the life that you want me to live. I'm going to follow you because you've been good to me and you gave me a seat at the table, and that's good enough. Doesn't matter if I have all the wealth in the world. Doesn't matter if I have the biggest church that people are attending. None of that matters. What matters is that you gave me a seat at the table. And because you gave me the seat at the table, I'm going to continue in your ways. And that was the everlasting hope which Mephibosheth had. It's the same everlasting hope that we should have in Christ Jesus. 1 Peter chapter, I didn't put the chapter on there. I put verses 3 through 5. So in 1 Peter, one of the chapters that's somewhere in there, verses 3 through 5, it says, blessed be the God of our Father, God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who, according to his abundant mercy, has begotten us to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to the inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are kept by the power of God through the faith of salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. In other words, we've got the seat at the table. It doesn't matter what's going on. We're going to have the seat at the table, and we should be thankful for that. Doesn't matter what else we gain out of it. Doesn't matter what we lose out of it. We have a seat. I had talked about earlier that Mephibosheth was sought out by the king. Remember, he lived far away. And it wasn't just that the king said, well, he needs to come here, and if he makes it here, then all's good. He was sought out by the king. He sent his own men to grab him and bring him back and to pay the expense. And I want you to understand that we too have been sought out by the king. He came to us. He didn't just say, hey, if you can make it here, you got something pretty great waiting on you. He came to us and said, I have something special for you, and I'll make sure that you're able to get there. Romans chapter 8, verse 32. He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how shall he not with him also freely give us things? John 1:4 talks about him, 1:14 talks about him coming to us. And it said, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. The King came to meet us in that far off place that we were. He didn't just look down and say, you're going to have to make it here on your own. But he provided that way for each and every one of us. David provided a way for Mephibosheth to be able to make it to his household, to be able to live. Mephibosheth's situation was probably one of the most unique situations in the entire Bible. He was one that he would have struggled his entire life. Tell me if this sounds familiar like you. Would have struggled his entire life. He would have lived his entire life up to that point in brokenness. A brokenness that was no fault of his own. He would have been looking over his shoulder every single moment, waiting for somebody to knock on the door to kill him. He knew that there wasn't much that he would have, but he didn't realize that the brokenness was a blessing in disguise. He didn't realize that there was a promise that was made even before he was born. He didn't realize that there was nothing that he could do to save his own life. There was nothing that he could do that would have restored anything to him. It was only at the hand of the King that it could have been done. And it's the same with us. There's nothing that we can do. Really. There's nothing that we can do to earn it. The only thing that we can do is accept it freely. The only thing that we can do is being able to take it to somebody else who we know doesn't have it also, because there's nothing that they can do else either. Maybe it's not that we should be looking at it today as God sending somebody to me because we've been following him for a while. But what if you're one of David's men, so to say? What if you're one of the King's men, that your responsibility is to go to somebody and let them know, hey, the King wants to see you. The King wants you seated at his table, eating with him for the rest of your life. Perhaps that's also the way that we should look at it as well. Because the same things that happen in Mephibosheth's life, physically happen in Mephibosheth's life, are the same things that are going on in our lives. Nothing we can do except accept it. Amen.